2.5 Admins, episode 15. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, do you want to plug your History of FreeBSD Part 2 article, Alan?
Yeah, so over on my company's website, we have the next part of our History of FreeBSD series. And this one's really good about the early days before FreeBSD, when it was just BSD, and the AT&T lawsuit. And there's lots of great history in there, and there's links to a lot more of the old nostalgia stuff. It's very interesting.
And get in contact if you want to advertise on the show. If you work for a company that's looking to get the word out there to a technical audience, then get in touch, show@2.5admins.com. So let's start with some news then. And Cloudflare, in the last couple of weeks, announced a couple of things. Cloudflare 1 and their browser isolation beta. Now, Cloudflare 1, I read this at length, and it took me a while to even understand what it was about. But in the end, it seemed to be some sort of single sign-on based service.
Yeah, that was the impression I got too. Once you wade through 5 pages of marketing fluff, it looks like they're basically saying it's multiple single sign-on backends. They're saying they support like lots of them at once. So you can tie your Okta or your, Google or your whatever else single sign-on authentication to, it looks like they're saying network level authentication, like basically to the firewall. So your firewall then knows whether or not you've successfully signed on via Okta or whatever, and determines whether or not you're allowed to get a packet to your target.
It's a bit that, and it looks like they also have a bit of a bigger version of a VPN. So connecting your data center to the Cloudflare edge via the Cloud Network Interconnect, and then connecting your office to it via like a dedicated IP transit link. And then their kind of VPN thing called Warp for roaming users. And then putting that all into their smart routing platform that would then use the single sign-on stuff to decide what you're allowed to do. And it talks about like inbound filtering and DDoS protection. It's like, well, if everything on the right side of your chart here is my data center, my office, and my users, where's the DDoS getting on that side of the network?
I think there are also angry marketing emails coming to you right now, Alan, for daring to call one of their products a VPN, that antiquated word for antiquated, terrible things that Cloudflare 1 replaces.
But it provides the secure web gateway and allows zero trust rules. Because the other thing that it adds, in addition to the single sign-on, is this device integrity stuff. So CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, or VMware Carbon Black, or whatever, that's some cruft that runs on your laptop that claims that your laptop's not compromised. And if it doesn't claim that, then you can't get on the VPN.
Yeah, I really hated that part, saying that they tied it in with those integrity verification systems, because the first thing that brought to my mind was that horrible like IBM Trusteer endpoint crap that banks, want people to install. And the only effect that Trusteer endpoint actually has, as far as I've been able to tell in 10 years of dealing with it, is it breaks the internet routinely. Beyond that, doesn't really seem to accomplish anything.
I was reading through this and I was reminded of the article that you wrote that we talked about last time, Jim. This seems to be like an almost productized, simple way to solve the problems that we were talking about of everyone being remote.
A bit. Like the idea of if you connect your data center and your office and your remote users all to it, then it gives you that kind of a network where you can access everything. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem of moving data across. It's still not going to be that fast. But like Jim was saying, using RDP to get from your remote machine to either a machine in the data center or in the office that has magic transit to the Cloudflare 1, and so on. But really, that just seems to be making a Cloudflare-only version of the internet.
It's really annoying trying to dig through all the marketing fluff and figure out what does this actually mean and what does this actually do. But I think there is one facet of it that's kind of important to talk about. When they talk about how they're leveraging these single sign-on services like, Okta and what have you, and tying that to IP-based, access rules, what that really comes down to is like usually you have things behind a VPN because basically you don't trust the actual authentication systems they already have, right? Like you don't put RDP directly on the internet if you're not, a little functionally challenged, because you don't trust the authentication interface to get hammered on by random people. If you wrap that behind a VPN, then now you've said, well, now people have to hammer on my VPN, which I trust a lot more than I trust that RDP authentication. So basically, a lot of what Cloudflare is, potentially accomplishing here is they're saying, hey, you can still run these services that you don't actually trust people to access. And although it's not a traditional VPN, now we have different authentication to allow people to get to this other authentication route. But you're still basically saying, I'm going to wrap all the crap that I don't really trust enough to, expose to the internet behind some other level of authentication that I think is maybe a little bit better tested, better trusted, better federated than mine, and hope for the best.
Throughout this whole conversation, there's been this unspoken subtext that you don't like Cloudflare, both of you. And for me, there's something about Cloudflare that rubs me the wrong way, and I can't put my finger on what it is. Is that fair to say that you two are not huge fans of Cloudflare generally?
In this context, I wouldn't agree with that. There are things that I dislike about Cloudflare, like how incredibly slow they are to do anything about, enabling a ridiculous number of hate sites and, being super duper free speech advocates that, oh no, we totally need to protect Nazis from getting, booted off the net. I don't like that, but that has nothing to do with, any implied disdain here. I just really don't like having to wade through 5 pages of fluff to figure out like 2 sentences of what this technically does.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Cloudflare, mostly because they keep trying to act like they invented all these concepts and that they're the only CDN and that, we stopped the biggest denial of service attacks ever. It's like, no, you didn't.
They're trying to centralize the internet as well, or the web at least.
Yes, that's the other thing. It's like we talked a bit about before. It's getting to the point that if you're not having your content served by Cloudflare, Google, Facebook, or Apple or somebody, then they're doing everything they can to squeeze you off the internet. Cloudflare wants to create this one network that's not the internet, that is the Cloudflare approved network. And only, it's basically create your own walled garden, kind of like Facebook has become, where, you don't even get links off of Facebook. The content just gets slurped into Facebook. We've also just seen them break everything many times.
Well, that's the thing. If you've got every website in the world, every important one behind Cloudflare, and Cloudflare goes down, then half the bloody internet goes down.
It's especially when it goes down because somebody at Cloudflare thought it'd be good to make a rule that blocks IP packets that are more than 64 kilobytes when that's the limit. And so it just made all the routers fall over because that's an invalid rule.
I think the biggest thing that points to is not necessarily a failing of Cloudflare's, but kind of a failing in the rest of the industry that nobody else seems to be interested in doing that same work and providing a solid competitor. I mean, there are, of course, other content distribution networks, but I don't know of anything shady that Cloudflare did to make everybody go with Cloudflare. It just kind of seems to be where everybody is headed.
Well, they gave a bunch of it away for free for now until they get the market share, and then the price will suddenly change. Once it's like you're using Cloudflare or you're not going to survive on the internet, then I'm sure that will change. They can't keep giving everything away for free for very long.
So you're saying Cloudflare is the 1980s Japanese television of content delivery networks?
I was thinking more like the Walmart, where they come in and destroy all the small businesses in a town, and then the prices go up.
Yeah, or Amazon that's destroying even Walmart these days to some extent.
That's how Japanese industry destroyed the American television market. That's why RCA TVs aren't a thing anymore, because they were actually selling below cost to corral the market and then be able to drive the cost back up again. Welcome to capitalism.
A bit of a controversial one then. WordPress recently forcibly updated people's Loginizer plugin to fix a very, very serious SQL injection bug that it was a horrendous bug. This was a very popular WordPress plugin. I didn't know that WordPress even had this ability to forcibly update people's plugins on self-hosted WordPress sites, but apparently they do. You can understand why they did it, but it makes me a bit uncomfortable to think that they can do it.
Yeah, I can understand why people would be leery of that, especially, one of the times this happens, the plugin's going to, have changed something or done something that somebody doesn't want the upgrade on purpose. But, at the same time, WordPress also has to do something to fix its image of just the reason every website gets hacked. I think my biggest concern with it happening would be how often I've seen WordPress upgrades go sideways.
Really? I've found that WordPress, as long as you don't mess with the CSS and stuff, the automatic updates of WordPress seem to be fine. And the plugin automatic updates seem to be working fine now.
My problem is mostly that the sites I'm dealing with are more like the WordPress multi-user and WordPress, the multi-site thing, like giant things for media companies and stuff, where there's tens of thousands of posts and it's actually 5 different websites in one database and all really complicated setups rather than the 15 posts that our website has.
I haven't really had any trouble even with multi-site WordPress installs. I've managed several of those as well. The problem that I always have with WordPress sites, you end up with a site owner or creator who goes looking at like every WordPress plugin known to man and goes, I like this one and that one and the other one, and maybe I'll want this one. And by the time you come to look at this site, there's 50 different freaking plugins installed, and they don't even know which ones they're actually using versus they've just installed and activated. And it's just kind of sitting there. Then something goes sideways.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a mess trying to unsort that. But I've never really seen like a simple WordPress install, including multi-site, with like well-designed themes and a few well-designed plugins. I haven't really seen issues with that.
Yeah, I think you hit on the point there, is that it's more the problems we've run into is, the big news website has got like 60 plugins, and some genius over there decides to install this other plugin that's going to help them track the URLs people entered at that were actually a 404, and where were they actually trying to go, and it turns out it logs this into the database, and then there's like 500 million rows in that table, and then every time it wants to walk them all the time instead of just appending, and then the whole website falls over.
Or plugins that are just littered with PHP eval and similar wonderful best practices.
All kinds of stuff. So like, you get the support email, our site's not working properly anymore. It's like, did you install a plugin yesterday? And like, yeah, how'd you know?
Where do you stand on forced upgrades then?
So here's where I stand on, quote, forced, unquote, upgrades. I mean, your policy needs to be clear as to how upgrades work and how they're initiated and, if they're opt-in or opt-out and yada, yada, yada. But I mean, this is 2020, man. If you're installing something that's going to touch the internet, you really need to have automatic security upgrades on it. If you aren't the developer who will be writing the patches to fix it to begin with, you really shouldn't just be living in this mindset of like, oh, I have code and this code is good and it will continue to be good and I'll deal with it if and when I need to. That just doesn't work with the modern attack landscape. The plugin in question had horrible security implications, and it's hard to imagine how even a botched update, which we didn't have, but even if the update was botched, how botched would it have to be worse than the problem?
Even if it broke your whole site, at least it meant they couldn't compromise it.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Datadog, the unified monitoring and analytics platform for comprehensive visibility into cloud, hybrid, and multi-cloud environments. Quickly analyze the performance of your Linux servers in real time with customizable dashboards and troubleshoot Linux issues in seconds with a unified view of your metrics, traces, and logs all in one place. With integrations for over 400 technologies, you can even use Datadog to monitor key Linux source metrics alongside data from the rest of your stack to get full visibility into the health and performance of your entire infrastructure. Start your Datadog trial today by visiting datadog.com/25admins. Start your trial, create one dashboard, and you'll get a free Datadog t-shirt. That's datadog.com/25admins. Let's do a bit of free consulting then. If you want to send your questions in for Jim and Alan, you can do so via email show@2.5admins.com. And if you want to support creation of these episodes, you can do so on Patreon. The details for that are at 2.5admins.com. And thank you everyone who is supporting us. It's really appreciated. And remember, if you support us for $5 or more, you can get an advert-free RSS feed. We're inching towards our goal of $500 a month. Once we get there, we'll go weekly with the show. So do check that out. So Josh writes to us, I have several VMs and containers running on my home lab, including a Plex server, Ever since I've been working from home, I've constantly hit my 1 terabyte bandwidth limit and have been charged the overage fee. I need a way to set up a network monitoring tool that I can enable at the gateway level, something that I can just change in my DHCP settings, a proxy of sorts. I want to know how much bandwidth each of 30 devices, including VMs, on my network are using. Being able to see that traffic would be a plus, but not necessary for my use case.
So you probably don't want to use a proxy just because that will only capture the HTTP traffic and is more complicated. But like you said, at a gateway level, if your gateway machine is where you're going to be able to run this, then it should be relatively straightforward to count the traffic. There are lots of different ways to do this. It depends how you want to do it. I've done it a couple of different ways. It can be as simple as using count rules in the firewall and just saying, incoming traffic from this IP gets counted by this rule and managing it. But that's probably not the level of solution you were looking for. I think, Jim, you had an idea for something, didn't you?
Yeah, the package that's going to be, it's called ntop-ng for next generation. That's the, if you ever use a pfSense router, that's actually the traffic management interface that you see in pfSense. They just adopted ntop-ng, but you don't actually have to install pfSense to get it. It's a completely separate package, and like on Ubuntu, apt install ntop-ng, and poof, you've got web-based, traffic monitoring, like it's done. At that point, the only thing you need is, for the traffic actually to be routed through that machine to begin with, which presumably is the case. If not, then you could just set that up. I know he said that he's using VMs already. If he's not already using that machine or a VM or a real Linux or BSD box as his router, then he could just set up an ntop-ng VM and enable gatewaying through that. And then, like you mentioned with his DHCP, just have his DHCP assign that box as the gateway address rather than the actual WAN router, and done.
Exactly.
Once you've got ntop-ng installed, you can go into it with your web browser and authenticate, and you can see lots of different views of your traffic. They have a concept called flows that's really useful for monitoring what's going on, either in real time or from kind of a historical perspective. So, like if you've got one particular culprit amongst your VMs that's eating all your bandwidth, you'll discover that very quickly using ntop-ng. Now, beyond that, if you want to start actually shaping your traffic to maybe alleviate the problem a little bit, there's a really great package called Firehole that's quite easy to install and use and set up rule sets to, usually I use it more for, priority stuff to make sure I've got nice low latency on my SSH sessions and whatever. But it might also come in handy for limiting aggregate bandwidth consumption.
Yeah. On BSD, you can use something like DummyNet to create rules that for either prioritizing or saying this host going to this service can't use more than this many megabits a second or whatever to control the traffic.
Firehole, by the way, does not look like Firehole. It's FireHOL is the main project. And that one is actually the parent project. Firehole is it's really more of an IP tables management kind of a deal. But there's a portion of the project called FireQoS, which can also be installed individually, that does what I was talking about with the traffic shaping. I use FireQoS on my own homebrew Ubuntu router in my house.
Yeah, and like Jim was saying with the ntop stuff, it'll break down the traffic by which host did it, but also even just a service. So you can see most of it is traffic going to Netflix, or it's mostly traffic that's not HTTP and something else is going on. And you could use that to track down what's doing what.
You can also track it by destination IP or port or what have you. Basically, just about any way you can think of that you might want to look at your overall traffic, you can do it.
Am I a dinosaur for using VNstat then?
You're not a dinosaur, but I don't know that you have exactly the same wants and use case that he does. If you want to look at things in more of a real-time basis, like from the command line and just kind of see what's going on right now, VNstat's a great tool.
For that, I also like iftop.
I use iftop a lot also. And there's another one called NetHogs. If you want to know what your traffic looks like on the machine that you're on by process rather than, by remote port or what have you, NetHogs is a good answer for that. You can see, how much traffic, how much network traffic, Chrome is using versus Firefox or Samba or whatever else you've got, running by the actual process ID that way, which can come in handy.
Sean writes to us, what open source software would you recommend to perform and manage tape backups, LTO 5 and 6, on Windows and Linux servers?
That is all you, Alan.
The only one that I've ever done anything like that with was Bacula. And so you basically set up one machine as the director, and it has a database that keeps the index of, will be able to tell you which tape you need to go get in order to restore a certain thing or whatever. And then there's the agent that goes on all the machines that you want to back up. The agent for Windows has support for volume shadow copy and all the stuff to even, back up Microsoft SQL databases and Exchange mail stores while they're running, that kind of thing. And obviously there's clients for Linux and Mac and BSD and so on. And then I forget what it's called, not the file daemon, the storage daemon, I think, will go out and fetch backups from all of those. And it manages doing, full backups, differential backups, incremental backups. It even has synthetic backups, which basically takes a full and some of your differentials or incrementals and makes a new virtual full out of it, so that you don't have to do the big slurp, especially if you're pulling over slower links rather than, all over the LAN or whatever. And it has great support for lots of different tape libraries. So yeah, my recommendation is Bacula.
This sounds like golden age science fiction, where you get on your spaceship with the great big fins and, powered by tape-loaded computers, you travel to the stars.
I thought you were supposed to be the old man, Jim. How come you don't know about this?
I know about it. I know enough about it to have avoided tapes for like 30 freaking years now. That's why I immediately passed that one off to Alan. I'm like, tapes? Nope.
The last tapes I personally managed was the SCSI tape deck on my 486, which could back up like 400 megabytes on a giant cassette tape that had like a metal plate in the bottom. And then when I worked at the power plant, it was my job a couple of times to like pull one tape out of the tape deck and label it and put it in the box and put in the fresh tape. And then it would walk its way down to the bottom of the tape robot. It was fun to watch the tape robot when that was never a thing I had never seen before. But
the majority of my professional interaction with tape drives over the last at least 20 years has been telling people, no, your tape backups are not any good. This is not surprising. And then removing the tape drive, from their plan and installing something better.
Yeah.
Is it the same technology, essentially, as the old Commodore 64 and Amstrads and stuff?
Well, I mean, those literally just used Philips cassette tapes.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. Is it that same magnetic tape technology that we're talking about here?
Yeah, it really is.
It's just, they've got it much denser and better now, where you can get like 40 terabytes on a tape. Of course, the tapes are always like, assuming that our hardware compression will get 2.0 to 1 compression, which it never does.
No. It'll totally compress the crap out of your MPEGs and AVIs and zip files, man. They'll be tiny.
Or your already compressed ZFS streams or whatever.
Yeah.
Fair enough. James writes to us, I run a home server on Ubuntu. It doubles as an occasional desktop PC. My wife accidentally shut it down instead of logging out the other day. How can I prevent GDM and non-sudo users from powering off or rebooting the machine? There are lots of answers to this online, but sadly, all before the switch to login D.
There's only one problem user in this case, so honestly, I'm going to advise James the same thing I advise a lot of clients in similar circumstances. User training is probably going to be more effective than a technological solution here.
Yeah. Like, I don't know about Ubuntu in the first place, and then once you throw login D into the mix, even less clue. On BSD, you have to be part of the operators group to be able to do a shutdown or reboot as non-root. But if you aren't part of the operators group, you also won't be able to do things like mount USB sticks. So there's not really a more granular solution to say, you can do everything except for turn the machine off.
Well, since the switch to System D, you can literally open a terminal and type reboot, and it will reboot. No sudo required, just as a regular user. So, yeah, I think Jim's right on this one. The only solution is user training.
I don't doubt there are ways to, gin something together to try to make it more difficult for that to happen. It just doesn't sound worthwhile in this case. If his problem was any of 30 people might walk by and do this thing, then, okay, let's look for a technological solution. But, when it's just your wife accidentally shut the computer down one time, I mean, honey, don't do that. And problem solved.
Yeah. Now I'm picturing all kinds of crazy solutions like a cron tab on another machine just doing the magic pixie wake up packet like every minute. So if it ever gets turned off, it just turns on again.
Or like a watchdog looking for like reboot processes and just trying to kill them before they can do anything.
Yeah, but like I'm sure there's some way with some policy system in systemd to take that capability away from that one user or whatever. But yeah, that sounds like a lot of work and something that might not persist properly through an OS upgrade, and then, we'll bite you again later.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Lernard. Sign up at automation.link and use the code admins to upgrade and get 50% off a year's subscription to a new DevOps training site called Lernard. The site covers the entire DevOps stack, starting with the basics of infrastructure as code, and includes almost 8 hours of lessons on Terraform, Ansible, Jenkins, and loads of industry tips along the way. If you're interested in learning DevOps, take advantage of this offer by visiting automation.link and upgrade with 50% off with the code admins. That's automation.link and the code admins. Okay, an anonymous person writes to us, I prefer to turn on auto updates where I can, but I had an issue on my home server where the Dkms module on ZFS on Linux wouldn't rebuild every time I had a kernel upgrade, which would cause my ZFS pool not to mount on restart, creating issues for accessing files on the server until I had the spare time to get to it and rebuild it. Do you have a recommendation to ensure Dkms modules are automatically rebuilt when there's a kernel update?
I wish I did, but the answer here really is that Dkms already is supposed to do that. So, something broke in that process. And that, unfortunately, is a thing that happens, in my experience, pretty frequent with Dkms, whether it's ZFS related or not. I had to give up on my wife having an 802.11ac Wi-Fi adapter in her workstation because she suddenly decided that it should be somewhere where there was no wired network jack, and I had to provide Wi-Fi. And I gave her a Realtek device, but it needed out-of-tree drivers that had to be updated with Dkms. And, after like the third time she reboots and it no longer works, I'm like, screw this. And I put an old 802.11n adapter that used the AT10K driver in to avoid that problem.
You decided to go cutting edge like Alan does.
Yeah. So basically, the issue is just that Dkms is not 100% reliable.
So the solution is switch to Ubuntu then?
That would certainly be a solution, since Ubuntu does not use Dkms with its ZFS, or you could go completely crazy pants and, join Alan and FreeBSD land, where there would also be no Dkms layer to worry about. You could also, pin your kernel version and only upgrade kernel versions manually. But basically, no, I can't give you some way to make Dkms always work without somebody jogging its elbow. It doesn't.
I'm wondering in this case, is it that it was triggered properly but failed to rebuild, or was it literally just Dkms never ran and so never tried to build the newer ZFS?
I can't speak for the OP. Obviously, I haven't seen logs, but I have seen quite a few ZFS and non-ZFS related Dkms failures. And a lot of the time, for whatever reason, it just does not work. It does typically fire off, but like with ZFS specifically, back in the old days, I frequently would just have to completely uninstall the ZFS Dkms, package and then reinstall it, and then everything would work right. But trying to, from the command line, manually force a Dkms build would not work. I would have to remove and reinstall that package.
Interesting. Previously in FreeBSD, we've never really had this issue, but more lately, specifically our graphics drivers are sensitive to even the minor version of FreeBSD. So going from 12.1 to 12.2, the graphics drivers, our package repos where we build the binary packages are built by the oldest supported version of that major release. So we build packages for 12.1 and 12.2 on a 12.1 machine. So we build one set of packages and it works on both. And that works for everything except for about 5 kernel module-y things like VirtualBox and the graphics drivers.
Why do you need graphics drivers on FreeBSD?
Because we have full support for the brand newest Intel graphics drivers, and you need them to run a nice desktop on FreeBSD.
No one runs a FreeBSD desktop, not even you do.
Yes, I do. There's one right here.
Well, next to your Windows box that you're talking to us on.
There's one right here, right next to the computer I use.
There's one Windows computer in my house and 8 FreeBSD machines.
Yeah, and which one are you using, Alan?
I'm recording the podcast on the Windows machine, but I do my day job mostly on the FreeBSD machine, and this one is the one I do when I travel. And then the third FreeBSD desktop machine is the one that's on my exercise bike, and it lets me watch stuff off Plex while I exercise.
Oh, so you definitely need a graphics driver for that then.
Yes.
Fair enough.
And it's the Intel graphics driver and it works fine. But anyway, so there's been some wondering about doing something, DKMS-ish for FreeBSD for that small set of things where the kernel module needs to match your kernel very closely. And it especially is a problem if you're running the development branch of FreeBSD where, the packages are built on some snapshot that's, plus or minus a week from where you are, and means that there's a high probability the package isn't going to work for you.
Well, maybe once you've built it, we can port it to Linux and not have to deal with Dkms anymore. All right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, you can send your questions for Jim and Alan to show@2.5admins.com. You can find me on Twitter @JoeRessington.
You can find me @JRSSNet.
And I'm @AlanJude.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.